Yama Malian. Hello, friends. If you're joining us live this morning, I hope you got yourself a nice warm cup of Joe's and you're ready for, yeah, like I said, a rip of yarn for the next couple of hours. For those that haven't met myself, my name is Blake Allen Cansdale. I'm a proud N1 man. My ancestral country is in northern New South Wales. It's around Walker, Armidale, Uralla. However, I was born in Cogra on Dharawal country, and I was raised most of my life on Dark Young country on the central coast of New South Wales, a place that I'm still very much privileged to call home today. I'm also honoured to say that I currently serve as National Director of ANTAR, formerly Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. Before diving in and giving the deadly Tony McAvoy SC the microphone, I want to kick things off this morning by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the beautiful lands of the Dark Young peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all of the lands and waterways that each of you are joining us from this morning. And please feel free to drop an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians in the chat. For me, acknowledgements of country, and for many people, acknowledgements of country and welcomes to country, they're absolutely not just a formality. All Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land and waterways, all country, it has memory. It holds the stories, the struggles, the laughter, and the resilience of our ancestors. It remembers every footprint, every scar, and every act of resistance, and certainly every act of survival. And so, when I do an acknowledgement, I'm paying my respects to elders past and present, those who carried our culture from the dream time through unspeakably difficult colonial times, and those who absolutely continue to carry our culture to this day. I honor the unbroken physical and spiritual connection between people and place, and I stand in solidarity with the sovereign owners of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands across Australia. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, I am the National Director of ANTAR, which means by extension that I'll also be your host for the next 2 hours. If you're not familiar with ANTAR, we are a First Nations-led ally organisation that's been fighting tirelessly for justice, rights, and respect for Australia's First Nations peoples. It's just shy of 3 decades now. From day one, ANTAR has been doing what we can to support First Nations campaigns working to address issues impacting our people and our communities. In addition to our policy, research, and education functions, ANTAR is also very much actively a participant in a range of campaigns, including at the moment the Close the Gap campaign, which is hosted by the National Association of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Workers and Practitioners, a campaign to see, of course, the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is being led by Uluru Dialogue and supported by the Allies for Uluru Coalition and, of course, many others nationwide. A campaign for a Human Rights Act in New South Wales, which is being led by Human Rights Act for New South Wales Alliance. A campaign for a federal Human Rights Act being led by the Human Rights Law Centre. Alternative First Responders campaign, which has been led by a mob called National Justice Project. The Know Your Country campaign, which is actually now hosted by ANTAR ourselves. Raise the Age, both the national and New South Wales campaigns, which are led by Change the Record and Justice Equity Centre, respectively. A campaign for a Commonwealth Cultural Heritage Reform, which is being led by the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance. I mean, the list goes on. For a small but mighty team, we're very active in a lot of incredibly important reform campaigns and initiatives. So before we move into our first formal session this morning, I want to thank you all for joining me for the ANTAR's 2025 National Forum. I absolutely realize it's no mean feat that you've all found the time to be with us today, whether you're joining live or you're watching after the fact. It's your commitment being with us now that gives me personally confidence that there's a path to a better future for our communities, for our children, for the entire nation as a whole, really. Your turning up like this is a big part of what contributes to establishing the kind of movement of the Australian people for a better future that the Uluru Statement from the Heart speaks to so powerfully. Quite fittingly, then, the theme for this year's ANTAR National Forum is First Nations Representative Voices. Where to from here? As you're no doubt aware by this stage, we're going to be hearing from an amazing lineup of speakers over the next 2 hours, beginning with the prolific Tony McAvoy, Senior Counsel, who's going to kick things off with a keynote address. Then we're going to jump straight into a panel discussion with three deadly younger, I won't say young, we'll say younger First Nations leaders. We got Bridget Cama, co-chair from the Uluru Youth Dialogue. We got Jeffrey Winters from director from Council of First Nations, and Bonnie Dukakis as a CEO from Koori Youth Council. Before we ask the legendary Cheryl Axelby Keefe to bring us home with some closing remarks. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic to Tony McAvoy, but before doing that, just a few quick words by way of introduction. Tony is our Weirdy Man from Central Queensland and Australia's first Indigenous Senior Counsel who was appointed in 2015. Tony holds a Bachelor of Laws from QUT and Doctors of Laws honoris causa from both QUT and UTS. Tony's legal career spans more than 40 years, having commenced as a law clerk at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service in Brisbane in 1983. He was called to the bar in Sydney in 2000 and has since developed a practice in native title, land rights, treaty, truth-telling, inquests, inquiries, human rights, environmental law, and criminal law. Tony has held and continues to hold many prestigious professional positions and titles, and Tony has made incalculable contributions to advancing First Nations representation in Australia over the years. All in all, Tony is a mentor, an advocate, and a leader who is committed to justice and self-determination for Indigenous peoples. So thank you for joining us, Tony, and over to you.
Thanks, Blake. I'm coming to you from Glymarrigal country in the northern beaches of Sydney today. I acknowledge the traditional owners across the continent, all those First Nations, and I acknowledge all the people on this morning's conference, First Nations people and non-First Nations people. I acknowledge you all. Thank you for joining. You might notice my shirt today. This is my shirt that I wear when I'm doing work in the Torres Strait Islands. I was told the first time I went up there to do work that I needed to have a bright, flowery shirt for important occasions, and I've decided to put it on this morning. I'm not a Torres Strait Islander, but I have plenty of friends, Bala, and I acknowledge our Torres Strait Island brothers and sisters. This week has been a particularly interesting week for me work-wise. I was in Brisbane on Wednesday for the Meanjin oration held by QUT, and then on Thursday afternoon, I spoke at the closing session of the National Indigenous Legal Conference. And then on Friday, I was in a mediation for most of the day in Brisbane in relation to a native title matter in which I'm acting for one of the parties. The reason I talk about that is that those other matters is that in keeping with today's topic, one of the matters which I spoke to in the Meanjin oration was First Nations identity. And I expressed the view there that for my part, I prefer the term First Nations because it signals that we are talking about bodies that have political status as nations, and it ties us to territory, being in the sense that nations must have territory, and in reinforcing our territoriality is a very important aspect, I think, of the present political debates. But I'm not wedded to that term, and I understand that there are other terms, and that indeed First Nations is a term that was coined in Canada, and it means first in time, but also first in law, and it is intended to signal first but continuing nations, not first but long gone. So, in speaking during the Meanjin oration, I talked about some of the matters which go to our First Nations law in relation to identity. And we're all familiar with the three-part test, which is the Western law version of the way in which identity is broad-based Aboriginal identity is acquired. But how is identity acquired as a First Nations person? My experience in having been raised in my family and in my community in Queensland, and having worked in many different areas of the country with many different people, is that there are really two things that of greatest importance. One is that you are a bloodline descendant to that country, but there's room for adoption, but not everybody accepts adoption. And the second thing is that you are accepted by that nation. And if you're accepted and you have bloodline, then you are a member of that particular First Nation. You're a citizen of that First Nation. And the only people that can make the decision about whether you're a Wurdi man or a Anawan man or a Gomeroi man or woman or a Gumbaynggirr or Yuin are the people of those countries themselves. Now, in Australian law, in 1983, in the Tasmanian Dams case, the High Court of Australia adopted the three-part test, which is that you must be of Aboriginal descent, that you must identify as an Aboriginal person, and that you must be accepted by the community. The last part of that test is very vague, the third aspect, and it has led to a lot of confusion over the years. The High Court test, the test that was developed by the High Court came from a report commissioned by the Department of Aboriginal Affairs in, I think, 1981, as to how to identify Aboriginal people. Since the Tasmanian Dams case in 1983, and of course, for those of you in New South Wales, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act 1983 has that same three-part test. But since that time, we've had the Mabo decision, where the High Court, in the decision of Brennan, talks about being recognised by the native title holders being that group of people who are recognised by each other and by the elders of that particular group. And it seems to me that formulation was far closer to our traditional law. In recent years, the High Court has looked at the case of a case called Love in the Commonwealth and Toms in the Commonwealth, often referred to as Love and Toms. It was determined in February 2020, and the High Court judges were not uniform on this, and some said really it's a matter for the community to decide, but ultimately, but many of them said, well, the court's going to have to decide it at some point, and the court will be the ultimate arbiter. In my view, the court cannot be the ultimate arbiter. The ultimate arbiter must be the people who are asserting their sovereignty and lawmaking powers in connection with their country according to their laws and customs, and they must make their own decisions. Now, some people will say that may lead to injustices. Well, it may, but they're our injustices, and it's our business to make those decisions. Now, the context in which I raise this in the Meehan generation and raising it today is that in the 2021 census, there was a 48% rise in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population from the previous census 6 years before in 2016. That rise in population was unprecedented, and one of the reasons for that rise in the population was an increase of 92,000 people who are identifying for the first time, what they call first-time identifiers as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, in completing the census, it's possible for people to say, well, I have an Aboriginal ancestor and I can tick the box that says Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person. But it's not an action without consequence, in my view. What happens is that the overall population of Aboriginal people raises, and then figures which go to establishing and monitoring the effects of government programs on our people are skewed. The true outcome for our people is masked. And so just taking the justice figures, at the moment, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the most incarcerated people in the world by a long margin. We are incarcerated presently at a rate of 2,300 people per 100,000. The next closest is El Salvador, with 1,300 people per 100,000. So 1,600. So the margin is significant. But on my calculation, if you took out all the new identifiers, first-time identifiers, that figure would be 2,600 people per 100,000, 300 more per 100,000, which has and so the effect of it is to reduce the increasing the measurable increase in the rate of over-incarceration. It's saying, well, it's gone from 1,800 to 2,300, and it's increasing at a certain rate, but in fact it's increasing at a much higher rate if you don't take into account first-time identifiers. And there's a good basis for not taking into account first-time identifiers, because usually if you're identifying for the first time as an adult, it's unlikely, it seems to me, that you will have been raised in a community. It's unlikely that you will have been subjected to trauma and intergenerational trauma. It's unlikely that you will have all the health concerns that we have, because you'll come from different socioeconomic background. That's the reality of it. And so there is a consequence to it. Now, since native title has come into existence, we have had a process of recognition of people who have continued law and custom which predates the arrival of the British, and the native title process requires the identification of those people who hold that law and custom, and the satisfaction that that law and custom has continued since pre-sovereignty. Now, these are the elements of a continued sovereign status, of a continued sovereign nation. And in Australia, I'm not sure how many of our listeners are aware of this, but in Australia, we now have over 500 native title determinations, positive determinations. So it's not the case that this is happening in one or two places across the continent and the coastal islands. It is extremely widespread, and there are 500 different determinations to the effect that the people who were originally on those lands before the British came continue to exist and continue to live by their laws and customs and continue to hold their rights and interests. So it seems to me that those native title holders are likely to be the same group as what we self-describe as First Nations. And so the various First Nations across the country will have obtained native title, and some of them have done their native title claims in piecemeal fashion, and that's why I think we're at 500. But it signals to us that there is already in existence a huge network of First Nations, and the conclusion I've come to is that really we need to start identifying as First Nations people, those of us who are part of a community, part of a First Nation, as accepted as members or citizens of that First Nation, and then have a separate category for people who have identified that they have some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, but do not participate and have not been accepted in the community business. Just so that we can isolate those figures and ensure that, as far as support goes, it is directed to the places where it's needed. Now, that's at a human level. At a structural level, we have in Australia been cycled through numerous representative bodies from the Fakatsi days in the late 60s. There was a National Tribal Council, the National Aboriginal Conference, the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, ATSIC, the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, and then a couple of advisory councils. And apart from the National Tribal Council, which is only in existence for a short period of time, we have not had a national advocacy body which is premised upon having each person at the table having a mandate to speak for their own country, which is what you have if you're nominated as a First Nations representative. In contrast, in Canada, they've had the Assembly of First Nations since 1982, and the Assembly of First Nations were integral in ensuring that in the Canadian Constitution, there was, as it was reformulated, there was a section included in that Constitution, Section 35, which provides constitutional protection for inherent rights and treaty rights. Well, of course, we don't have that here, but the point of comparison is that the Canadian Assembly of First Nations has continued in existence all that time and has been able to bring the weight of its continued existence and the consistent policy to bear on the Canadian legislative and policy landscape. And it is an amazing testament to the First Peoples in Canada. They have annual general meetings of the General Assembly, which attract over 600 First Nations delegates. They have regional forums of the Assembly, and they develop national policy and advocate towards that national policy. After the referendum failure, a few people got together and talked about the need for that type of platform in Australia. We were very fortunate that Rachel Perkins, as the co-chair of the Australians for Indigenous constitutional recognition had heard about what we were planning and doing, and approached us and said that the AICR was needed to wind up. Its job was done. It was over, and it had a little bit of money left over, and so we thought about it and got some advice, and ended up replacing the members and directors on AICR. We're able to continue on with the access to the database that was created during the referendum, but also got a small amount of money. And with that small amount, we were able to hold a national gathering in Port Douglas in September this year, at which there were 167 First Nations represented and over 300 traditional owners, whether from a representative of a native title body or representative of a traditional owner organisation, as I was. I'm the chair of my own traditional owner organisation in Central Queensland. So that meeting had a lot of discussion about what the shape of the organisation might look like and what it would do. There was an incredible amount of support and goodwill. People just seemed to want to think about it, and we undertook to provide more information, to call another meeting next year to progress it. My view about it is, although there is a advocacy vacuum at a national level, it's not something we should rush if we want it to be a body and a platform that has real longevity and is sustainable over decades, such as the Canadian Assembly of First Nations is, rather than going through the cycle of organisations that we've had here in Australia, and the obvious pitfalls from not having that sort of consistency. Now, Jeffrey Winters is on the panel, and he's part of the Assembly of First Nations. We're very lucky to have his assistance, and I understand he has been working on some of the structural issues and may talk to you about those later on. What I could say is, from my perspective, is that the Assembly of First Nations in Canada is not representative of everybody. It's not intended to be representative of everybody. It is not a catch-all. It is representative of the issues and matters of concern to the First Nations of Canada. And similarly, in Australia, it seems to me that is what we would do with the Council of First Nations. It wouldn't be everything to everybody, but it would be able to pick up a lot of the issues that currently exist. So I think I've used up my allotted time. I've tried to pack as much information in there as possible. I might leave you with those thoughts, and I think that might work neatly in with the panel to come, Blake.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Dan. In 20 minutes, we could do it 20 days of your time just quietly, but so could everyone else. It's you pulled from pillar to post, so really appreciate you taking the time, particularly on a Saturday morning, to be with us.
I've been saying no a lot lately, Blake, because my diary's so full.
We're extra privileged to have you this morning. Then I do appreciate it. I don't take it lightly. The enormity of particularly mob, they're out there on the front lines doing the work we're doing, making ourselves available. Yeah, that's tough. So I really do appreciate it. I'm sure everyone else on the call today appreciates you being here. So.
Yeah, well, there's one further thing I'll say is that as tough as the national work is and the big picture political work is that needs to be done, I can tell you that the work as chair of my traditional owner corporation, the Wangan Yagalingu Traditional Owner Corporation, is just as important and just as hard. I mean, dealing with trying to work through the grant systems and ensure that young people are supported and we've got access to country and that we're able to protect country is a constant and difficult task. And I think many of us have to operate at both those levels. We get called in for the stuff at home as well as having to operate at the national or subnational level. So I hope that doesn't sound like a complaint. I'm very privileged to do the work I do, and thank you for inviting me. And I will stick around for a little while, if that's okay.
Of course, we'd love you to stick around, check out the panel, and then Cheryl will bring us home. But I didn't hear complaining at all. I think it's really important to, take this opportunity to share your story and the reality that we have of being community people, deeply embedded in our local governance and embedded in culture, country, and community at a local level, but pulling up, at state and national representative levels and any number of committees and bodies. It's something I think a lot of Australians don't realize, that complexity and the layers of responsibility. It is also a privilege. I'm sure you take it as an honor and a privilege to have that, cultural responsibility and to be in the position you are to fulfill that in the ways that you do. But yeah, it's no mean feat that you are. So I think it's really great to be able to share those stories to bring everyone else into that understanding.
Yes. Well, thank you, and thanks for Antar's ongoing support of our issues.
Not a problem.
All right.
All right. Well, maybe then if we'll drop the spotlight now onto the panel, hopefully all the speakers are here, ready to go. I haven't actually checked. And uh, Tony's going to stay with us. But maybe to keep things on track, will they come up on the screen there? So I'm jumping straight to the panel discussion. See a couple of there. Hey sis, Bridget, how are you? Bonnie, nice to meet you. I look forward to meeting you in person one day. No, no, Jeffrey. I saw him come in before, so he'll pop up on the screen in a moment. So yeah, we've got three brilliant younger, again, I'm not going to say young, I don't want to be ageist, so younger First Nations leaders up on the screen. Well, Jeffrey in a moment. There's Bridget Cama, as mentioned before, the co-chair of Uluru Youth Dialogue. We have Bonnie Dukakis, the CEO of Koori Youth Council, and in a moment, hopefully, Jeffrey Winters, non-executive director from Council of First Nations, will be joining us. Rather than myself taking up any precious real estate doing intros, I thought I'd just jump straight in and let each of the panelists perhaps introduce themselves, and I'll facilitate a bit of Q&A for the next 60 minutes or so. Maybe I'm imagining maybe there's a slight technical hiccup that we haven't got Jeffrey there just yet. Nonetheless, in the interest of time, I think maybe we'll just pop Jeffrey at the bottom with the first question to intro. So, Bridget, would you mind jumping in and maybe just telling everybody a bit about yourself and about the Uluru Youth Dialogue?
Thanks, Blake. Hi, everyone. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge country and all of the lands in which you're joining us from today. I'm fortunate enough to be here on Bidjigal country and have been here for nearly 10 years now. Been able to start my family here, be educated here and work on Bidjigal country. But just a little bit of background about me. I'm a proud Wiradjuri and Indigenous Fijian woman. I was born and raised in Lithgow, New South Wales, but my connections are further west to Mudgee and Wellington. Um, I'm the co-chair of the Uluru Youth Dialogue, which was co-created alongside Alira Davis in 2019 as a response to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and continuing the movement forward, but particularly giving young mob a platform and a space to discuss firstly what the Uluru Statement from the Heart is, but in order to make sure that young mob had their voices heard in the movement. And so the Uluru Youth Dialogue sits underneath the leadership of the Uluru Dialogue, led by Pat Anderson, Auntie Pat Anderson, AO, and Professor Megan Davis. And throughout our time establishing the Uluru Youth Dialogue and then continuing the work, we kind of focused on community education around what the Uluru Statement is. And then, of course, as we moved into campaign mode, once the Prime Minister called the referendum, it was, weekends and weeks kind of out in community on the ground, doing those sessions, talking to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in community, everyday Australians about the importance of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its invitation, the importance of constitutional recognition for First Nations people and that history, and then, of course, what the actual proposal was and where it came from. So that's really where our work was focused during the campaign. We continue today. I think the Uluru Youth Dialogue come from a position that we remain committed to the reforms called for by the Uluru Statement. We've recently taken a delegation of Uluru Youth Dialogue young leaders over to Geneva to attend the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people at the UN in Geneva, and we continue that work towards constitutional recognition of First Nations people. And I think, like, just a personal reflection on that is that young people did have an interesting response post-referendum, where I think for a lot of our elders, it did feel like defeat, and that they hadn't had the opportunity to see this come to fruition in their lifetime after many decades of advocacy for recognition and for a voice. But for young people, they were knocking on our door kind of the next week, being like, what do we do now? So that really, I guess, gives a sense of there's a lot of hope and optimism, particularly from young mob across the country.
Nice one. Thanks, sis. And Jeffrey, nice of you to join us, brother. Did you having some
I was the
trouble?
old young person who couldn't turn the camera on, so I
Yeah, good on
apologize for that.
you. Okay. Well, whilst you got your mic and camera going, did you want to just quickly introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about the Council of First Nations, picking up on Tony's intro there, and then we'll throw across to Bonnie the intro, and then we've got a few questions. We'll mix it up.
Certainly. So I'm Jeffrey Winters, Gamilaroi, Walgett mob, dialing in from Gadigal. Lovely, cool day in Sydney, finally. Acknowledge, of course, elders and also Tony and all the work he and the leadership team are doing on the council. I was lucky enough to get invited in to help out about 6 months ago. And I think, and this kind of dovetails with what Bridget was talking about just then, I came out of the referendum thinking, okay, what's next? And I think a lot of people were fatigued and thought, oh, deflated. But actually, I think younger people and, guys like Tony have worked for mob for years. It was just the next battle, right? And this kind of exercise that we're going through is really wonderful, because I think it actually taps into the best of what First Nations people have to offer when it comes to leadership. It's very practical, it's very patient, and it's very personal in terms of being grounded in everyone's own country, working slowly at the pace of community, but also being very realistic about what and how we can achieve goals. And so I think it's a really exciting thing to be involved in, and I've learned a lot, and it's going to be a great discussion to talk about what we're doing at the moment.
Too deadly.
Thanks.
Bonnie, if everyone didn't know, sorry, I had the privilege of getting to know Bridget and Jeffrey quite well, but I'm really excited to take it the wrong way. You two, really excited to get to know more about Bonnie, yourself, and Koori Youth Council. It seems like you're doing some deadly work down there. So could you just intro yourself and tell us a little bit about you guys and what you do?
Thank you. And thank you for having me and inviting me along today. And the first time I've been able to see you on screen, at least, Blake. So appreciate the patience. Before I begin I would like to acknowledge country and pay respects to traditional custodians. For me here, I'm on Wurundjeri country in Naarm in Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, but also extend my respect to everyone on the call today, to your ancestors and to your connections. So Bonnie de Carcass, I'm a proud Gunditjmara woman. So my ties are Southwest Victoria, Portland, Hayward area. Grew up on the other end of the state in Victoria in Gunai country, down Bensdale, Sale, Traralgon. And for anyone kind of familiar with Victoria, it's one end to the other. But now get the privilege of living and working in Wurundjeri country as the CEO of Koori Youth Council. So for those that don't know, we get the privilege of representing the voices and aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young mob living in Victoria. And I think something touched on and something I want to call out, like, we've been around for over 20 years now, which is incredible. But we actually started from what was back in that ATSIC day. So I think Tony touched on ATSIC as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. And at the time, a lot of conversations that were happening, and particularly in Victoria, around about young people, and in the Victorian arm, we're like, well, how do we actually hear from the voices of young people to be able to provide input and advice to us? So we were born out of that in terms of the Victorian Indigenous Youth Advisory Council back in the early 2000s, and then have kind of grown to be what we are today as Koori Youth Council. I also get challenged on that by some of our community leaders around, we've been having gatherings since the 80s of young mob around coming together and kind of really championing change. So I don't take lightly the point of being in Victorian based and acknowledging that. But I guess take my hat off too to many that do the national landscape. There's a lot of things that are happening in Victoria, and I guess something as well just to kind of touch on. There's a lot of things happening, particularly for and against young mob at the moment here in Victoria. So it's kind of been a pretty challenging time. In the last 2 to 3 weeks, we've had the signing of treaty, which is incredible. Same day, we've announced that we're able to push forward to lock up young people aged 14 to life sentences. So it kind of goes in contradiction along with the social media ban coming into effect next month. So kind of working through a lot of that. But as well, in terms of the Victorian context, for us, we actually get a seat at the table at all the Victorian state level policy and advocacy forums. We love agreements down here in Victoria across different sectors. So justice, we've got the longest justice agreement in the country for the Aboriginal Justice Forum and Justice Agreement. So we actually get a seat at the table in all of those alongside our sector leads and our community members. So really privileged. I think the count at the moment is 7 governance forums, including the youth sector rep for Closing the Gap in Victoria, as well as I think about 26 ongoing working groups. So a lot of meetings, but on the flip side of that, we also get to host a lot of gatherings and work in with our community orgs that are delivering on the ground to young mobs. So really kind of how do we elevate voices and experiences through our work? Just a little.
Yeah, fantastic. I first and foremost so proud he is down there and really inspired. But I'd be lying if I didn't say I'm a little bit jealous as well. The empowerment, the importance of treaty and what's going on there. I'd really look forward to that flowing in a proper way up in New South Wales as well and affecting my own communities and country. And I appreciate that you picked up on the really devastating fact at a historical moment like that, there's something just the antithesis, and anathema to that was occurring with the government attempting to lock up more of our children. So it's really complex, difficult times that we're trying to navigate in politics. But hey, I'm sure our elders and our elders would say such was the reality for them historically too. So really stoked of what's going on down south and look forward to that as a platform for nationally seeing similar things continue moving for some jurisdictions and really get moving properly for others. So I'd like to then throw, because there's a question I want to ask all three of you. So I might go back to Bridget. I'm really keen to hear from yourself personally what having a voice means to you, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit, because it's quite a rich term in itself, voice or representative voice.
Yeah. I think first of all, I'd just like to say, we have a long history of advocacy by First Nations in this country, for a voice, or effectively a say on the matters that affect us as First Nations people in this country. And obviously the most recent call for that was in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that was for a constitutionally enshrined voice. But what effectively that would have been was a representative body that is able to speak on behalf of First Nations people right across the country when decisions are made about us by politicians and governments. So it's about being able to participate in political decision making. It's about participation in democracy. And of course, when we look to our rights, it's about the right to political participation and self-determination. For me, like obviously mob have voices, we have voices, but they're not heard, and that's really at the core of what the voice idea is about. It's about being able to have our voices heard in these processes. So I think it's really important that voice or a representative body would be truly inclusive and representative of how we exist as First Nations communities across this country. That it includes, people of both traditional owner status through Western systems of law and native title or non-traditional owner status, that it includes young people and members of the stolen generation, and non-binary people. I think this idea of a voice, it has to be inclusive. Most importantly, it has to be bottom up, that it is elected by community to speak on behalf of community. And so effectively, I guess what I'm saying is that it goes back to, I guess, the design principles and what was discussed as part of the regional dialogue process for me. That does hold like cultural authority and mandate in my view. And ultimately, what this would lead to is better laws and policies, because these processes would be informed by people, by mob on the ground who have, lived experience, generations worth of knowledge and expertise in these areas, and most importantly, solutions, I guess. And for me, what voice means is success, I would say. For now, we've seen, 20 odd years of closing the gap initiative with very little success. If anything, we're actually moving backwards. It's clear it's not working. We've also had the continuation of various policies in Aboriginal affairs that haven't delivered the results that we needed. For example, the economic empowerment agenda. So it's really clear that we need to do things differently. And I guess this is what voice really means to me. We need to move beyond seeing governments consulting or only talking with people who they handpick, whether that's through, various groups, coalitions, or leaders, and see them really commit to consulting more widely with communities on the ground.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Sis. So, not to loop us back to Victoria every time, and I'll try not to, but that's something I've reflected on a lot with the treaty readiness process, the years and years of, and we've been doing it all over Australia, but it's really focused, I guess, in a way with the treaty readiness, watching it from afar, mob mobilizing, determining what our decision-making protocols are and who speaks for country, and working through some of that healing that needs to occur from the effects of colonization on our communities, so we can more confidently then figure out our representative mechanisms and come forward to engage with government and the wider community. That's one of the things I'm really excited for. In New South Wales, as our treaty process, now has kicked off several months ago, and it's not going to be an overnight thing, just like we saw in Victoria. And again, it's a national thing, decades of moving towards treaty and determining, different generations, determining how we're going to represent our interests. So I might even ask Bonnie, and feel free, Jeffrey and Bridget, if you want to reflect on it too in subsequent questions. I'll certainly be asking Bonnie to reflect a bit on, from her perspective in Victoria, that matter. Anyway, enough from me. Jeffrey, can we throw over to you? Same question. I'd love to hear from you. What what having a voice means to yourself.
Yeah, I think I've been on a bit of a journey in the last 6 months since working with the Council of First Nations, in that I've known Bridget for a long time, and the work she did with the campaign was phenomenal, and it was something I was very energized by. And then afterwards sort of thought, well, what do we do next? But something I've learned from Tony and the other board members at the council is that there's a real power in going slow, and there's power in sort of quietness. There's a cultural grounding that gives a lot of power that isn't reflected in the statute and isn't reflected in the Constitution necessarily. It certainly isn't now. And as I started to step into that, okay, sit quietly with your people and try and learn, one of the big challenges we had when we started to think about what could a national body look like was who decides who's in, who's out. And being a lawyer by training, my view was, okay, let's structure I've got to think about a document and how it's all written down, all the rest of it. But actually, what the elders brought to Port Douglas was, okay, we'll figure it out in our communities, and it's our responsibility and our job where we come from to sort that out. And when we're ready and when we've got it together, we'll engage and bring that, and collectively that's powerful. And so there's sort of this idea that you don't need to write it all down and be articulated in a Western legal framework. And someone said to me at the Port Douglas gathering, this is effectively a decolonization of empowerment. And I had to really go on a journey intellectually to get my head around this, that actually I don't need to sit down and draft what the membership looks like and who's in and who's out, etc. That's up to mob and it's up to community. And saying that is very powerful as a design concept. So I think, one of the problems in hindsight, and we're all experts in hindsight, with the referendum was it was so beautifully designed and exquisitely intellectual. And the country is so far off being ready to accept that. And so going slower and giving the power to community and to culture to lead, I think, is the pathway forward. And that's the voice. And so the voice is actually much softer than I used to think it was. It's much more quiet. It's very grounded.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. I love that. I wish I had my own language, an our one language. I wish I had a word for this, or even another First Nations language. But one of my favorite words is actually a Japanese word that you made me think of, which I had to bring up the definition here. Yutori. It's the conscious act of slowing down to allow us to savor the world around us. The refusal to rush, no talking, just absorbing the world around us with no goal except to see. Just made me think about old people and our ancestors and the way that we did business back in the day, which is very hard in the fast-paced society that we live in today. It's all about productivity and efficiency, and we've got two worlds that are really different worldviews and different ways of operating that we're trying to navigate and consolidate in certain ways. And
well, very, very early on in this process of me trying to get my head around what it might look like, I had a lovely breakfast with Marcia Langton, and she was like, there isn't an iteration of a body or a national thing that we haven't already designed. For goodness sake, I keep the voice report on my desk next to me every day. And that's just a condensed summary of 50 years worth of excellent work. The issue isn't designing a national body. The issue is about grounding it in authority and culture and bringing, the 26 million other people who probably don't quite get it yet on that journey. So that's where it's at for me. And I don't think yelling at people ever brings them on a journey. I think you've got to really slowly demonstrate why, they are blessed to live in this cultural landscape and how much they have to gain from it. And it sucks that we have to demonstrate that to them. We shouldn't have to. That's the injustice, but that is the task.
I've certainly learned that the hard way over the years, and I still need to check my ego and anger and emotions from time to time, and that's understandable, completely understandable. Anyway, let's Bonnie, I'd love to, if you don't mind, hear from yourself as well. What voice means to you personally.
I firstly just want to call out, I personally don't take it for granted in Victoria, some of the mechanisms that we already have in place that allow that piece to happen. And I think everyone has heard this before, and for me, it's really thinking about for young people, like, how do we give young people a voice? And many of us on the call, we all have young people in our lives, whether in our own families and our communities, and we know that they're always the first ones to tell us when things aren't working or when we can do things differently. So I think it's really shifting it in terms of that thinking. It's not just around how to give young people a voice, it's how we elevate it, how we listen to it. And something that Bridget touched on before too, it's going out broader than just who we always go to, but how do we hear from voices and experiences that are different to our own? And we look at it a lot and challenge a lot of particularly government spaces where they go, we want to hear from young people. We've already done all the work. This is what it looks like. But how do we hear from young people when it's not aligned with what the professionals and the adults are thinking? And we know that that's when things can really change. And that's even reflecting on the experience that it's actually, with everything that happened with the referendum, that it's the young people that are then going, well, what's next? And the younger generation going, okay, well, we've had our elders and our ancestors have been fighting for this for such a long time. Where to from here? How do we do things differently? And I think that's something that we need to come together collectively in our communities and think about what that could look like and getting that support. And been really privileged that sit in a lot of spaces with some of our elders and community leaders here that we are actually understanding how we got to where we are. So not just looking at I think, what's next, but how do we also honor what's happened? And I think that's a big piece as well. Or how do we, like, I think particularly the conversation around ATSIC has come up a lot of late, and understanding how is the work of First Peoples Treaty Assembly in Victoria different to what we were looking at establishing then. And ATSIC was well before my time, but I remember my dad being involved in that. So understanding like that generational involvement and participation, but broader than just to be representative, but how we hold systems to account, I think is the next piece. So moving beyond just having a voice and being able to talk about where things aren't working, but how we make sure that it can be embedded in processes and that accountability is back on systems and structures to actually create the spaces for, particularly for me, for young mob, to have their voices heard continuously, regardless of the government of the day or the systems in place, and really embedded it in just the ways of working normally.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm sure we all would have heard this one before. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and it is absolutely true. And I'm reminded that, I'm sure you are too, each of you, almost every single day. And I think that comes back a bit to that slowing down and grounding what we do, everything we do in community and culture. With that comes, I think, that deep, acute understanding of where we've come from and all of those things, whether we personally in our conscious existence touched those historical moments, they are part of us nonetheless through our people who have done that, our communities, and even the organizations, such long-standing advocacy and important processes that they've been involved in. So there's so much narrative and story, so much richness we need to draw from. So yeah, there's a lot of interconnected factors there I can hear through the different responses from all of yourselves. And maybe just back to Bridget, picking up off on Bonnie, you mentioned there the importance of younger mob having voice and representation. You started to talk to, the kind of mechanisms that we might see be effective in ensuring that happens. So, Bridget, would you mind maybe telling us a little bit about how, in your view, we can ensure that young or younger mob are involved in decision making on matters, particularly matters that significantly affect their interests, which all too often I feel like is not the case.
Yeah, and I don't want to repeat too much of what Bonnie has said, because I think I would answer this question quite similarly. I think what's really important is that there needs to be the acknowledgement that young people be at the table every time a process, such as like the regional dialogue process or the treaty process happening in Victoria, like every time a process happens, young mob have to be represented as part of those processes. That's the first thing. When it comes to the accountability, that's where the struggle is, because if we're left out of these conversations, what power do we have? Well, we have to then turn on our elders and our older leadership to say, where are the young people at this table? So it's really about, us as young people looking to our leaders and our older people saying, like, can we have this? Can we take up some space here? And just from a personal experience, that's how the Uluru Youth Dialogue developed. Up until that point, young people had been a part of the regional dialogue process, and it was mandated that there were young or youth representatives as part of the First Nations regional dialogue process. However, after the statement was issued, there wasn't like this huge movement around young people, because, of course, culturally, our authority sits with our elders. But it was a combination of Alira and I going to senior leadership and saying, we think there's a really important space here that young people need to be a part of. It isn't clear that it's there yet, and we want to create that space. But that, of course, then requires our older people to then say, go for it and back us and provide that mentorship and support. So I guess one of the things that I'd add is just ensuring that our older people and our leadership see the value in young people bringing our perspectives to the table, being able to create that space, and then succession planning, I think, which is something that we don't do very well, unfortunately, and there's room for improvement there. But succession planning is really, really important for us as mob, and continuation of these movements. I think we can all agree that what we do see a lot in Indigenous affairs is the same voices that have really dominated this space for many, many decades. And like with all due respect, you know, the amazing work that's been done. But at some point there is going to have to be that handover of younger leadership coming through. So I think that's also something that we need to consider as mob moving forward.
Yeah, I know Auntie Pat Anderson's spoken really powerfully to the importance of that succession planning. That was partially in mind why I would love to an event like this, having amazing staunch advocates like Tony and Cheryl join us, but equally bringing some of yourselves in, which at the end of the day, we've got to pick up, unfortunately, a lot of the fights and what are the processes that our elders and elders, were working towards change over the course of their lifetimes? And I've got no doubt that there'll be much of what I am doing now that I pass on to my kids. And I have hope that some of those, come off the list and that there's different challenges. It's more about improvement. We're elevating what we're working and moving towards. But the reality is, yeah, that there's a lot of challenges that we pass on from generation to generation, and that succession planning's critical. So maybe a slight pivot, Jeffrey. I was going to be a bit cheeky and given your background, ask you, because it's in the realm very much so of representation. Uh, is it important for mob to be involved in politics? And assuming the answer is going to be yes, but I'd be intrigued to if you think no, what the response is there. If yes,
Well,
why so?
I mean, the answer is yes, but also it's such a dog's profession, right? Like it's awful. I've had the privilege and the absolute dishonor of being involved in politics now for a while, and it's horrible. Like you wouldn't wish it upon someone you dislike, but unfortunately, and Bridget knows this more than anyone because of her experience with the referendum, that is currently, given the structures of our society, how you affect change quickly or immediately. So do I think First Nations people should be running for government, local, state, federal? Absolutely. I think we've got, Bridget might know the number better than me, I think we've got 10 First Nations members of Parliament at the moment, which is the highest ever. Obviously we've got the most representative parliament we've ever had in terms of women and diversity, and it's fantastic to see. Yes, I think the problem is we carry cultural burdens from our own family and where we're from and what we need to do in our communities, and then to layer that on top is an extraordinary ask, I think. And, every couple of years, and I'm about to do it again, I step out of Australia and live abroad, because when you live here, I'm sure everyone experiences this, you are the Aboriginal person in the room, or the Aboriginal person on the committee, or the Aboriginal person who has to have the view or perspective or give the insight on behalf of everyone else, right? I can't possibly imagine how someone like a Linda Burney feels at the cabinet table with that responsibility. So yes, I think First Nations people absolutely should get involved and get active. And, from Neville Bonner to Linda, they have made extraordinary contributions. I think it's an absolutely unrealistic expectation that's placed upon our First Nations leaders in Parliament. And actually, I'm getting cynical as I get older. I think you can have a lot of impact outside of Parliament, but that impact is amplified by having brother, sister in the House as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we need we need good people in all parts of society, all three arms of government, Parliament, the judiciary, out in the executive branch, and government.
Well, yeah, I'd rather see
communities.
an Aboriginal Chief Justice of the High Court before I saw a Aboriginal Prime Minister. But anyway, it's just me.
Yeah, that's the way I've always thought about. I've struggled a bit with the political pathway, engaging with it and seeing that as a space where I potentially could have impact. But the more I engage with it, the more I realize there's really significant opportunity, and it's incredibly important, like I said, to have really strong, capable advocates in all of those places and grounded in community. And in fact, I think it starts first and foremost with that strength in community through our own political mechanisms too, self-governments, primarily through our own self-governance mechanisms. And perhaps on that point, Bonnie, you would have touched on it a couple of times, but can I maybe throw it back to yourself for the treaty question? So I'm really curious to hear from a young person's perspective what treaty in Victoria means for younger mob in Victoria.
I'm going to throw it a little bit because I wanted to just touch on something that's been spoken about already, which has made me pivot in my thoughts. But in terms of structures, and we're talking about participation, we're talking around like tokenistic participation as well, like being the only black fella at the table at times, or the only young person, or whatever it is. And we actually co-authored a journal. We're actually published in the Medical Journal Australia. Definitely not a health expert, but did that alongside people that were and Aboriginal doctors, and overseen by Dr. Sandra Eads, but talking around the importance of Indigenous youth participation, but in a medical context. And there's a couple of things, and I can share through the article, so those that are registered can see it as well. But in particular, how we move from like that tokenistic participation, and what we talked about is like the 7 red flags of participation, and moving beyond that. How do we move from being there as, and how do we look out for things that are tokenistic or are not really there for the genuine change? And from being non-Indigenous led to having multiple seats, by looking at how we have, just going through being visibility, being included, where the power sits when the decisions are made. Are we there just to advise, or can we actually have meaningful dialogue around how we want to see the improvements and that accountability and that shifting of power? So I think there's a lot more in it, but I can go to that later. But I did just want to call that out as an example, and some work that we've done around knowing we're such a small pocket. I look at organisations like KYC. There's not others replicated across other states and other jurisdictions. So I think that's also something that's missing and needed in terms of that consistency. It shouldn't just be reliant on being a young black fella in Victoria that you have access to these things. Like, we want all young people to have that. We want that across all states and jurisdictions, which probably leads into the treaty yarn too. So we've been working really closely with them over a number of time, and one thing that they have really called out strongly is the need to have a youth voice through that process as well. And how do we do that in a safe way? And I think Bridget touched on that as well. It's around when it's not quite aligned with our elders, like still having our elders council and having their role and input is important. But when our views and young people's experiences are quite different, and especially in this time, even for us, we've got young people engaging with our organisation now that are younger than the organisation. To me, is crazy, but exciting, because I get 29 now, and I don't often say my age, but now I'm looking at the point that I'm being told I'm at that older end, but still got a lot to offer, and kind of looking at how do we empower our young mob to be able to step up into these spaces that aren't safe. I know I've been in spaces where I've had our elders just throw to me and go, what do you young mob think? What do you think? It's like, well, this isn't even part of our conversation. How do we bring back what we're hearing if it doesn't align with what the narrative is, or if we've got different views and perspectives, or we just want to have that young person at the table. So we've been seen to do that. A lot of the spaces that I've sat in, and I'm sure many here have, they're not that safe for a young person. And I wouldn't want to be putting someone in there just to have that seat at the table, but we need to make sure how it is supported. Going back to that like modelling piece, how do we bring young people along on the journey that will be inheriting a lot of these systems and structures that we're setting up? And how do we do that ongoingly, that capacity building, that nation building, going back to communities? I know, acknowledging I live in Melbourne now too, along with many others, but you shouldn't have to be coming to the capital cities just to build up your knowledge and experience and expertise. How do we take that back out? How do we build up those structures in our local communities and in our regions? And I think I hope that's what we see through this treaty process too, that real nation building piece that can happen, that resourcing to be able to ensure young people's participation, but also community participation in those processes. So probably not quite answered the question, Blake, but I think that was something I wanted to touch on.
No, it's perfect. You did plus some, so I appreciate that. And I think like it's a fairly complimentary question, perhaps back to yourself, Bridget, around what you see constitution recognition specifically meaning for younger mob.
I think we can all admit that constitutional recognition isn't like the sexy thing to be, like wanting to be involved in, and that's always a struggle in itself. Especially, when our communities are, having to deal with these issues that we all want to talk about, but can't find the solutions to every single day. Who really wants to engage in constitutional recognition? But on the flip side of that, I think our communities, are so smart, and that in combination with, hundreds of years worth of being excluded from systems and not having that self-determination and that voice to be heard. Our communities understand it intimately more than anybody else in this country. So I think the biggest challenge for young people, or for us as young people trying to get other young people engaged in this area, is actually just having that conversation about the Constitution, why it exists, and how it plays a role in our everyday lives on the ground. Because, I think one of the first conversations that you have when you go out generally to the Australian people is that we have a constitution, but then how does it affect us, and why do we need to change it? But then once you get those conversations happening, people are like, oh, well, that makes so much sense. Of course, we need to be recognised in our own country. Of course, we should use the constitutional law, or like the big law, to be able to exercise our rights and have our rights protected in this country. I think so. Ultimately, for me, and for the young people that are involved in the Uluru Youth Dialogue movement and our allies, constitutional recognition is really about, the big picture thinking of hope for a better future. I think when we do look to examples like Canada, and Tony has, spoken to this, it's really, really clear that constitutional recognition, or recognition of Indigenous rights in the Constitution, is really key to upholding rights, but also for First Nations people to be able to exercise our rights domestically. And that, of course, completely flips all of the exclusion that's happened since, I would argue since 1788, but particularly since 1901, which, of course, all of the issues that we're facing today are because of that exclusion. And I think, something we always said through the referendum is that we don't want to keep having the same conversations over and over again. We've talked about this already in this panel, that we don't want to pass these issues onto the next generation. And Alira and I have always said this will happen in our lifetime. Constitutional recognition will happen in our lifetime. I acknowledge that the country is not ready just yet, and we would have definitely benefited from a little bit more time. And Jeffrey spoke to that, about being patient and making sure that we do the work quietly and slowly, so that when we're ready to go again, people are ready. And that's something that the Uluru Dialogue has been working on post-referendum, around really unpacking the no vote. And I think, one really major thing that came out of it was that racism wasn't actually the key determining factor to the no vote. It's so much more complex than that. Something that I feel very responsible for is then going out back into our communities and conveying that message, particularly to our young people. I think when you talk to most mob, and I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody, but the first thing that they say is, like, Australians voted against us. It felt like a personal no to ourselves. But once we start unpacking that and talking about the complexities of the no vote, it lightens the weight a little bit off our shoulders, that it wasn't a personal no to us. There's lots of work to do, but it's really unhealthy and dangerous for our young people to sit in that space mentally if they're feeling like it's a no against them personally. We already know that, the incarceration rates, but the suicide rates are so high for our young people in this country, and it's really not a great space for our young people to sit in. And so I'd really love to see that work happen moving forward. So that brings me to my last point, and I think constitutional recognition is really about belonging, finally addressing the unfinished business of this country. Finally, having that sense of, we're acknowledged, this is our place, we're a part of this nation, and our history is, 60,000 plus years old, and continuing, that we make up so much of what this nation is. And just to be legally recognised will, I guess, change that mentality around who we are as a nation, being recognised in the founding document of Australia.
Great. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks for your reflections. So God, there's so much. It could be a whole workshop, a whole year, a further year, even 2 years post-referendum of unpacking a lot of what you've spoken to there. That's fantastic. We've heard a bit about, I guess, treaty now and constitutional recognition, the importance of those two mechanisms for ensuring appropriate representation of our people's interests. And both of you touched on that from specifically from a younger person's perspective too. Jeffrey, would you mind continuing on in that frame? And talking to what a difference might a national representative body make for younger mob across Australia?
Well, it's a fool's errand ever to try and correct Bridget, but I will correct Bridget on one thing. I think constitutional law is very sexy, Bridget. And so I think we should talk it up as being something extraordinarily interesting and charming and extremely attractive. So I'll disagree with you on that point. And I know you agree because you love it. I've copped more than one or two earfuls of you telling me how I'm wrong about it. So people downplay constitutional recognition saying it's symbolic, and that's such an easy argument to make because it's just so, dismissive. But symbols are important, and we're one of the few democracies in the world that has a written constitution, and that is a really powerful thing. And although I think David Marr once said Australians only vote to hide their shame of being told what to do. So if that's our culture, then we need to put it in the document that tells us what to do, because it'll feed into all of the ways in which we operate. And I make this point, in New South Wales, we actually do have constitutional recognition in Section 1A of the New South Wales Constitution. And I do think it does flow through the Parliament and the way people engage in this state. I mean, Victoria, it's such a shame to be on a call with the Victorian, now you have a treaty, because we all just look like mugs. And it's like, it was an extraordinary moment when that occurred. What was it, last week or the week before? And, I had friends from across the world being like, oh my gosh, Victoria's got a treaty. I'm like, symbols are important. If for nothing else, then it tells someone you belong here. And why are you telling someone they belong here when this is where they are from? This is their country. Everyone else should be invited to belong. Anyway, so I think symbolism is important and we should get it done. And I hope to dear God it happens in, Bridget's lifetime, because that'll be longer than mine. So I'll say Bridget's lifetime. And we got so close because of a couple of really smart, passionate women working really hard. So I hope it does occur. In the meantime, structures like the council and what we're working on, I think, work alongside, not in competition with, something like constitutional recognition. Tony spoke in his talk about how it's not an all persons thing. It isn't. This is about getting back to traditional owners and creating that structure. And I honestly think the country needs to go on a journey that is much more segmented in terms of, okay, understanding what it means to speak the country and having cultural authority, and how that feeds into, leadership and influence. But then also, stolen gen. Like, I was in a client meeting the other day, and I said to someone who I knew was a First Nations person in the room, "Oh, where are you from?" And it really upset her because she was a member of the stolen generation, and it was a massive exercise for us to then sit and get comfortable and respect each other. And that, to me, is an Aboriginal person going on that journey with her. So imagine what the rest of the country has to go on. I just think constitutional recognition is so important because it sends a message. I'm gay. When marriage equality went through, the tenor and the tone you felt on the street as a gay person was palatable. So I think for me, it's just symbolic went out the window when that changed for me. Ever since then, I have been completely 100% committed to constitutional recognition, because I think you will breathe more pure air when you walk down the street the day after it happens.
So, brother, just trying to help. Trying to help Cheryl get connected there. Had a quite IT issue I thought I could deal with quietly in the background, but I got caught out. All right, that gives us 8 minutes then. So I'm going to try and do the impossible because I've left a ripper till last. And maybe, Bonnie, can you kick us off with what your vision is for the future of First Nations representation in Australia? So a nice, easy, small one. maybe the
just a
elevator
small
version. It could be
question.
a big building, like an
Yeah.
elevator of a 50-story building, but I'd like to hear from all three of you if possible on that one. And any final reflections as well, obviously.
Um, I had so many thoughts, and I think it's kind of thrown me a little bit, but I think good ways. I think first of all, it's how we just normalize Aboriginal people and young people, particularly, as part of decision making. So not just being able to be the add-on. I think we see that a lot where it's often the afterthought. I think something I've always been told, and I'm sure many of us told, when we look at First Nation knowledges and ways of doing and being, it's a way that can benefit everyone. So it's around how we talk about it, how we have a shared language and understanding around what we're asking for and what our collective vision is. So I think that's probably the first piece. And then around, like in particular, often here and speaking with young people around understanding, and I go back to the constitutional recognition not being like that sexy language. I also say that in terms of policy and advocacy. Policy, I don't think it's not the fun stuff, but it's where you can see the shift and the difference, and in how we a lot of work that we do in Victoria around how do we bring young people on that journey to understand how policy can shape and change the way things work, and in systems where young people are impacted as well, and hearing from sometimes it goes between I don't want to speak on behalf of others, I just want to speak so this for myself, for my own family. And we've got others where we've got young people standing up and going, I want to speak because I want to change and I don't want to see someone else go through what I've been through. So I think it's having those different layers and ways to engage and inform, and whether it's and how we create that consistency across kind of particular decision-making platform. And I don't even know how to finish up with that, but I think for me it's around like just moving beyond just wanting to get that little seat at the table, but to actually make that meaningful change, we need to have more than one. We need to make sure that there's systems and mechanisms in place, that it's embedded, it's not relying on individuals. And I think a lot of our current workings is relying on individuals being there and advocating to add others into the space. So I think moving beyond individual positioning and having to have that person there to get someone else in the room, we need to create the spaces ourselves and call for it and understand it. But on the other side, we also need to be able to sit with it and have the time to respond. It's such a fast-paced environment at the moment that it's actually concerning that if we're not at the table, we're not going to inform it. So I think being able to, it's great to hear that there's a lot of conversations still happening, so we're ready for the next time. And I think community and mob have been the best at doing that over generations and over millennia. So I might leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. It makes me think of a saying that pops up every now and then: a rising tide lifts all boats. It's so important. It's not about any one individual or even a small group of the population streaking ahead of everyone else. That's capitalism manifest. That's the garbage. It's completely opposite to what our culture and our worldview is about, and bringing community along on that journey. It's so important. And a lot of weight sits on certain individuals, absolutely. It's by necessity of navigating Western politics and business and government. But the more that we can bring it back to community, and those processes like treaty and constitutional recognition and national representative bodies can build the base with the foundation of culture and community, and really grow that representation and strength from there, which hopefully would bring increasing more of our community along the journey. Then we can share that cultural responsibility and that cultural load. So that's fantastic. So I've taken up some of your time there. Bridget and Jeffrey, either of you want to jump in and just tell us quickly what your vision is for the future of First Nations representative voice in Australia?
You go, Bridge.
Okay. Thanks. I think I guess the one key thing, considering we've got a limited amount of time, the future of First Nations representation for me would be that it's guaranteed. Because with guaranteed comes accountability as well. So I think like what was being spoken about, particularly by Bonnie, is like we need to move beyond just representation. We then need to have accountability mechanisms in place. And 100% like that is the goal. I think that can only come through some guaranteed form of representative body, whether that be like ultimately constitutional would be like the ultimate guaranteed body. And we only have to look at the repetition throughout history of all of these bodies that have existed and have been dismantled, particularly ATSIC, which was quite successful and unfortunately, couldn't meet its potential because of the way in which our systems work and politics of the day. So for me, it would be a guaranteed First Nations representative body that represents community on the ground, where they don't have to leave their communities, where their voices are heard in Canberra, but they don't have to leave their communities in order to participate in our democracy. And I think, Jeffrey touched a little bit on this around, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander politicians. For me, that's important, but it's not representation. And ultimately, we want people, our mobs, living in community, but still being able to affect change and being able to provide advice and input into the laws and policies that affect us.
Yeah, too good. I mean, particularly given our culture, our people and our culture is where our strength is. So that sits with community. So to have to leave that in order to be quote unquote successful in a contemporary Australian sense, that's really, it's unfair, really unjust. So yeah, that's great. I'll let you pick up on that.
Yeah, and I think just on the accountability mechanism and things taking time, with having a guaranteed body, eventually that comes about. And I think, it's a conversation that we had to have around the voice that, it's not going to affect change the day after it's implemented. These things do take time. Sometimes it takes decades. And that's okay. Like there will be ups and downs and successes and failures, but where it's guaranteed, that means it can't be taken away. And so I think that's where it comes in around the accountability mechanism as well, where the body would be able to say what it wanted to say and truly represent the voices of mob on the ground without the concern of being dismantled if they spoke out or, their views weren't aligned with what governments wanted or their position was. So, yeah.
And this came out really strongly at the National Gathering in Port Douglas. Bridget was like, and I do think it was slightly reactionary, but I hope there's groundedness in it as well. This idea that the delegates didn't want government involved. So obviously they want to speak to government and have influence over government, but they did not want government involved because, as you pointed out and Bonnie's pointed out as well, everybody, ATSIC, I agree with you, like great model, but government dismantled it, right? As soon as it was politically convenient to get rid of it, it got rid of. So the reaction was, let's get government out of the way. My vision is Bridget in the Lodge, constitutional recognition, and a world in which the next kid born at St Vincent's Hospital down the street here views themselves as part of the longest continuous culture on the earth, a benefit of the most diverse multicultural society, and gets to have free press and the Westminster bullshit as well. That's my vision.
You mob. That is too deadly. Can we do another few hours? No, we'll book another one. We'll get his back another time. Love that vision, the lodge particularly. Yeah, I'm looking forward to finding out actually over the course of.
As long as she invites us for dinner, right?
Yeah, well,
I'm all for Bridget going to the lodge as long as she invites us for dinner.
That's assumed. I'd be offended if not. No, honestly, which one out of my network over the years is going to be the first Black Prime Minister? That's one worth betting on. So. That. Anyway, let's wrap it up there. And I want to thank you all. Huge thank you to the panelists. So you have Bridget Cama, Jeffrey Winters, and Bonnie Dukakis. Thank you for your time and our Saturday morning and being younger people. You probably got some fun things to get off and do, whatever that is, or go get your second orange mocha frappuccino from the cafe for the day, whatever you young people are up to. But no, honestly, thanks for all the fantastic work you're doing. It's too deadly and it's so critical. And I'm glad you could join us and share your stories, your personal reflections with everyone. And I'm sure it's the first of many more. So thank you all. All right, maybe if we drop the spotlight off of the panel, and feel free to all stick around. I'd love to have you for the last half hour. Hopefully we can ask the real Slim Cheryl to please stand up. Slim Shady Cheryl. There was some tech. Oh, we've got her. There you are. Excellent. I was worried we might have had some issues finding you there. Okay, so jumping straight into the final session, which we're bang on time, really, so that's excellent. I'd like to invite who is actually a former boss of mine, so I've got to be careful what I say here. A proud Narungga woman, an excellent human, and staunch First Nations advocate, Cheryl Axelby Keefe, to the microphone to share some closing remarks with us. Likely needs no introduction. However, I'm gonna give her one. So Cheryl, she has worked in various roles within government and community sectors with vast experience in law and justice, human rights, and Aboriginal family and youth services, child protection, and youth justice. Cheryl has held the position of CEO of the South Australian Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement. She's been national co-chair of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services and has held the role of co-chair of the only national Aboriginal-led justice campaign, Change a Record, for the last 8 years. Cheryl was elected as a representative of the Voice to South Australian Parliament, Adelaide Central Region, until September 2024. And currently, as the head of Aboriginal Housing at South Australia Housing Trust. Cheryl champions strategies emphasizing self-determination and empowerment, striving to improve the quality of life for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across South Australia and nationally. So let's maybe jump across to Cheryl and you can take over.
Namani, everybody, and thank you very much for that introduction, Blake. Honestly, it's just listening to the panel and also Tony earlier on. I just feel very privileged to be sharing, today with you all and being present with you. When I think about the younger generation and our leadership, it just instills in me great pride. So I just want to say and acknowledge each and every one of you. And I also like to acknowledge, of course, I'm talking to you on beautiful Kaurna country here in South Australia, at Tandanya in Adelaide. I suppose in the context of paying my respects also to my ancestors, who I hold very dearly and closely into my heart, and who also instill in me the drive, the spirit, the self-determination, and sometimes, call upon them, in those hours when you need, that strength, when you're feeling a little bit down. And particularly, when I think about the yes vote, and the outcome of that in particular, it did actually have an impact on me. And I think purely because, ever since I've been 17 years of age, I've worked, started my career working in the Aboriginal Legal Service, and then one day worked up to be the CEO. But that was because of when I think about the elders in our communities at that time, and just listening to the yarning there before around about succession planning, and that actually happened to me with a lot of the elders that were around at that time. They chose a pathway for me at that time. I thought about actually heading into law. I did paralegal studies, and then they basically had a vision that we wanted, to have our younger generation back then to start leading our own Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. Hence, that was my path and journey, which has also led me into, I was a previous ATSIC regional councillor as well. So I lived through that time, and still think it's probably one of the best blueprints that we have even going forward into the future, because it actually did get right down to the localised level with its representation. We did nominate our representatives, and also, then each of those, key representatives from each of those local areas became, the national representatives. So in that context, I just want to also acknowledge the wonderful Tony McAvoy. Tony and I have crossed paths in many parts over probably the last 10 years or so, particularly at the national level. And, hopefully, taking on board what Jeffrey was saying about seeing our first, Chief Justice. Hopefully that's Tony in the future. I think the work that he does out there, both, in his role as a lawyer, he is probably one of our most outspoken legal voices in the nation. And coming from a Aboriginal legal service context, and I grew up in that era, the 80s and 90s, in particular the 80s, where there was a lot of advocacy happening around at that time right across the nation about the building of our Aboriginal community controlled sector and our services. And, you know, I just think that, you know, our Aboriginal legal services are really important and should be still playing that both legal and political role, and advocating very strongly for not just our legal rights, but also our justice, social justice and human rights. So I just also want to acknowledge Bridget, Jeffrey and Bonnie. You know, your insight, and particularly, you know, around the Uluru dialogue and the work that's been done there, you know, into that context, Bridget, is, you know, I was also the co-lead convener in South Australia along with Clinton Wanganeen at the time when each of the states and territories were trying to bring together people in the early stages, and also had the great opportunity of being out there at Uluru at the time of the signing of the statement. And, you know, when I think about all of those what I call historical moments, you know, it's well known, you know, for ever since the, you know, impact of colonisation, that our mob have been very strong in its voice. So for me, I think we've always had a voice. The challenge that we have is, you know, how does that voice get listened to and adopted within the system and structures that we've talked about today? And I totally agree that, you know, having us represented in the Constitution is very important for our future generations. But also the challenge that we have getting there in this current climate. You know, this is why we have to instill and support our young leaders into the future, because it's important to know where we've come from and continue to actually, what we say, fly the gauntlet. But I think at times we also need to continue to have a bit of fire in the belly, what I call the fire in the belly, and that we can't do everything just through negotiation, because I think what's demonstrated, particularly, you know, over the last couple of years, is, and particularly when we see legislative changes that are going backwards, that are impacting our people even more. I feel like sometimes we're going back like 20 odd years in the context of legislation, and particularly the recent legislation that's happening in other states and territories around, you know, particularly in Victoria, you know, treating adults, young people as adults in the system, is a real cause of concern for us, and that does impact our future generations. So for me, that's something that I'm very passionate about, is our younger generation and in the system, and how do we decolonize that system so that it breaks away from its penal mentality that we actually have, you know, that's been inherited, you know, from that Westminster system, and how we actually start looking at self-determination and actually making decisions about what we need to do in our own communities to be able to make things and improve, you know, outcomes for our people into the future. And that's only through us by as been shared by everybody here. I agree with all the sentiments that's been said here today. There's nothing that I would disagree with. I think in the context, you know, it's a responsibility for us to reflect, inspire and continue, you know, the journey towards justice and true representation for our mob. It means standing in solidarity and honouring those who've come before us, as I've already said, and recognising the strength of our communities in shaping a fairer Australia, not just for us, but for all Australians. And it's also important that, you know, whenever we talk about a strengths-based approach, this is something I do talk about very passionately, is that we don't lose sight of the day-to-day struggles impacting, you know, our mob, our families within our communities, because sometimes, you know, I think, you know, we cannot mask and enter in a mainstream construct about language when we still know that we actually have very high overrepresentation of our mob, and particularly our young people. You know, we've got at least, you know, probably around about, I think around about 60% of our young people at one stage that were on remand were young people between 10 and 14 years of age. That's representative of all young people, and that's very high, and, you know, and that concerns me in the context that we are disempowered to be able to influence that in any way, shape or form. Also, when we think about the national representatives, we can acknowledge that the progress that's been made and the challenges that remain. And there have been significant steps forward. However, we must also confront the ongoing barriers that prevent genuine self-determination and effective representation. And the path is not always, straightforward, but our commitment to justice and equality drives us forward. And I think as long as we continue to have that vision of driving forward, and I listened to the context about moving slowly. I'm a little bit more impatient, I suppose, than most fellas. I'd like to see change probably happen a bit more quickly. And when I think about what's happened, the opportunities in South Australia, with the Voice to Parliament that happened in here, we'll see in March in 2026, at the time of the state election in South Australia, we'll see the second election for members for the SA Voice to Parliament. Over the last couple of years, the newly elected members have been doing everything they can to engage at the local, regional, community level within the resourcing provided. And I think that, when we talk about the setup of these bodies, and, I also want to pay respect to Victoria in regards to, its government, consenting to the treaty. And I know that's been an enormous amount of work that's been actually community-led and community-driven. And I suppose that in the context that when we look at the different states and territories and the representation within communities, some are stronger than others. And I think that's the point, that the lessons that we all can learn from Victoria, is that there has been this long continued history of standing together towards getting an outcome. And I think that's still some of the challenges that we face within our communities. And even just listening to the conversation today around, I think we don't have one model. I think there are many different mechanisms that we need to continue to ensure that we are keeping our voice and our issues alive and forefront, in the face of Australian people. Dale Agus, the Commissioner for the Voice, well, he's my nephew and I'm very proud of what he's been able to do as Commissioner for the Voice. But I'm excited by our younger leadership also that we actually have in the Voice. We have Leroy and Danielle, who are the two state conveners, co-chairs basically. And this is our younger generation. So it was purposely, it was an intent to ensure that, the leadership of the Voice in South Australia was coming from our younger generation and being supported by the members. And I think that's the commitment that we're starting to see right across the nation, which I think is very exciting. Yes, and I'm just looking at there that ACT has raised the age, but we're yet to see whether the services for young people are there. And I do recall, thinking about that raising the age context, just looking at one of the comments that just come up then, is that there was still some concerns around the, what would you say, the model around supporting young people through a mental health based approach. And I think that's was a cause of concern particularly for Change the Record at that time. In setting up of any entity, of course, there will be teething problems and room for improvement. And this is what I'm talking about for the Voice for South Australia. To ensure its success, there needs to be sound investment and proper resourcing and collaboration. And I think this will improve, the Voice to Parliament members and afford them the same equitable opportunities of accessing of resources as afforded to mainstream SA elected members. And although, the Voice to Parliament are not elected members of Parliament, it's if you're not resourced to be able to carry out the functions, to be able to engage with the community at the level that is required. And some of the community representatives, and you look at some of our communities in the 6 different regions, there's lots of travel that needs to take place within those regions. So, I think to me, no matter what is set up, and even if we, are successful into the future, as becoming recognised in the Constitution, which will be a major achievement in itself, then what does come with that is those type of resources and etc. that will enable us to be able to participate properly. For anybody, and it needs to be totally independent, in my view, and it needs to be able to set the agenda and also be enabled elected members and the state members to maintain strong connections with their communities, as I mentioned. The SA Voice to Parliament is still in its infancy. However, self-determination, independence is increasing. And, I think we need to do more with that body than just actually having a say about legislative changes that actually happens within the South Australian government. We need to actually empower the voice to be able to bring to the table the issues from communities and what those priorities are. Nationally, we've had many peak Aboriginal bodies, as we've already talked about today, ranging from, I think in the early days it was the Aboriginal Advancement League, which was again established by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people working together, in that context because of the injustices that were actually happening. And, we've had ATSIC and we've had the National Congress. And, what they were, basically, they all had a government investment into them. And then once that funding was pulled by government, or, we had the, the removal of any commitment to ATSIC by the government of the day, they were wiped away by the stroke of a pen. And I think this is the challenge that we have going forward. Do we continue to rely on government funding, or do we try to now start looking and seeking independent funding and, going to philanthropic sort of type funding, getting membership support, getting paid members to our national bodies so that we can become more self-determined and not tied or silenced because of us actually receiving funding from government. Our voices need to be, remain loud and proud. And to do that, we have to make sure that, and find a way about independence of funding into the future. But looking ahead, our aspirations are clear. We want to also build systems that are truly inclusive and led by communities. We've already had that today. We continue to advocate for representation that is not tokenistic, but is also embedded in policy and practice. And I totally support what was said there today in the context around, policy is an area where we can influence change. This means investing in First Nations leadership and ensuring that mechanisms are designed in partnership with those who lives are impacted most. And we need a balance because, what I've found throughout my experience over the years, and we talk about, fellows who are up there like leading the way, who often also get criticised a lot as well. So when you step up to the plate, there is that spotlight on you, just like there are on, non-Aboriginal politicians. A lot of our leaders, I look at them as, in a sense, as our black politicians trying to make a difference and try and make a change. We also need to be able to back our mob who are up there and support them, because one of the things that breaks my heart the most is to see that division and, how we talk about fellas up there and then, they're not elected by community when in actual fact they are. They're represented by a lot of their bodies. So I think we just need to get back to the reality that whilst we are diverse and we have many different opinions, when we got fellas up there, then we should be able to support them as much as possible. I'll finish up on the context of, our allies. Our allies play a vital role in this journey. True allyship goes beyond words. It's about standing shoulder to shoulder with us. It's about amplifying our First Nations voices, no matter what, and challenging injustices whenever it appears, no matter the politics of the day. And I think that's been the challenge, when we've seen the yes vote or, when we've seen the demise of ATSIC or whatever has actually happened in the past, is that there has been this negative rhetoric and campaigning that we see, sometimes by government of the day. We've seen it with native title, everyone's backyards were going to be overtaken. We've seen that with the voice, that we need allies to come out and counteract that and not be fearful that they're going to insult Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples by standing up, because I think we need to make sure that our allies, why? Because your voices are heard before ours, and that's the reality of my experience throughout many decades. And also when I think about some of the opportunities that we've had by standing shoulder to shoulder with other allies. And, one that I'll put up front there is ACOS and ANTAR. We have quite a lot of diverse membership sitting around Change the Record. And these are allies that have always put First Nations causes up and supported them, but also have taken it through, community-led, solutions. And I think that's and taking collective action. A key messaging reminds us, my key message reminds us that, justice reform must be shaped by those most impacted, and that together we have the power to transform our systems. By centering First Nations wisdom, achieving equity, not equality, but equity, and embracing collaboration, we can create lasting change for generations to come. And as we close, I offer my deepest gratitude to everybody here today, allies, advocates, community advocates, Blacktivists, leaders, however, you want to see yourself. Just want to say, I want us to leave this gathering with renewed hope, determination, and a shared commitment to walking the path of truth-telling, treaty, and the voice, because we need the whole three. And we have a devise, when we talk about treaty, we talk about the voice, people talk about sovereignty. End of the day, the outcome is the same. It's what we all want, which is our self-determination and our rights to be recognised. And together, we can build a future where every voice is heard and valued, particularly ours, and our diversity is respected, and our cultural rights, which is land, sea, water, and our human rights are equally valued as mainstream. So I just want to say thank you for the opportunity today to be sitting here and listening to the wonderful conversations that have been had, and it gives me the utmost hope, honestly, almost brings tears to my eyes, honestly, about the strength of our younger generation and the leadership of the future. So thank you very much, and keep up the deadly work.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. What a ripper way to finish things off. Honestly, thank you for closing with such rich reflections and also with such strength and clarity. Also, thank you for everything that you've done and that you continue to do for our people over the years. That's a great way to finish things up. Maybe I'll let you drop into the background there.
Yep.
Just before I lose everyone else, just perhaps calling it a wrap on the 2025 ANTAR National Forum. I might just share a couple of really quick reflections myself, and also leave a challenge to everyone that's still with us online, and the many, many people that'll watch this after the fact. So, firstly, I feel like what we've all heard this morning, it's been clear, consistent, and compelling. Thank you once again, all of you that are here with us as allies or as new entrants to the space, be it either. Thank you so much to all of the speakers, Tony McAvoy, Senior Counsel. We've got Bridget Cama, Jeffrey Winters, Bonnie Dukakis, and of course, Cheryl Axel-Keefe. What I heard personally is that we have the knowledge, we have the talent, we have the dedication, and we have the leadership. What we need now is the will from governments, from institutions, and from the broader Australian public to finally back First Nations representative voices in this country. Another thing that I heard a common thread throughout all of the discussion, and which I agree with unequivocally, is that our job now is in large part to build the movement. Without this movement, positive change will continue to escape us. Without persistent and widespread pressure, we will continue to be faced with an unacceptable status quo. However, with all of you here joining us today, and with the 6.2 million Australians that voted yes on the 14th October 2023, and also with a growing base of allies by our side, change, in my view, becomes inevitable. So when you go to close your laptop lid and head back to the cafe for your second coffee today, I encourage you all to ask yourself, where do I place my weight, my energy, my money, my voice, my influence? Because just remember, change isn't something that we wait for. It is something that we organize for. Now, last but absolutely not least, I want to give an enormous shout out to the ANTAR team. As a couple of people may have mentioned, I think, or may not have, we are a small but certainly mighty and dedicated and highly capable team. It never ceases to amaze me the impact that we're able to have with our small funding base. So on that, if you or anyone in your network believes in what ANTAR stands for and wants to back us to do more of what we do, please reach out and introduce yourself. We'd love to hear from you. On that note, 2025, another huge year of advocacy, research, policy, education, and impact for ANTAR. If you're interested to find out more about what myself and the team have been up to, I'm going to pop a QR code up on the screen, which is a link to our annual report, which is also now live on the website if you missed the QR code. So I'll leave that there whilst everyone's exiting building right. And again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you have the most excellent holiday season and break. Stay safe, stay grounded, stay deadly, and most of all, stay true to Uluru. Ngubari Murray. Big love, everyone. Yano.